Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting the Zombicide Supernatural Join the Hunt Pack 2. First thing I did was give Bobby's jeans 2 coats of rust grey, and I did the same for Jack as well. For John's denim I wanted a little bit of variation, so I've used Thunderhawk Blue. Jack received a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade watered down with some Lamia Medium, where Bobby and John both received a wash of Null Oil mixed with some Lamia Medium. For the Leviathan, I've used 2 coats of Black Templar contrast paint. Using Rust Grey, I neatened up all the areas on Bobby's jeans, and did the same with Jack. I then mixed some Fenrisian Grey to the Rust Grey for the one and only highlight I'm going to do on Bobby's jeans, and I used the same mix for Jack. I want Jack's jeans to be a little lighter, so I also added some more Fenrisian Grey to the mix just to brighten that colour up, until using Fenrisian Grey just by itself for the final layer highlight. For John, I mixed a tiny bit of Thunderhawk Blue and some Rust Grey just for one small highlight. With the jeans now out of the way, I'm going to start painting some Ogryn camo on Bobby's shirt, and Elysian green on John's. Bobby's shirt was given a wash of Army Painter Soft Tone, while John received some Athonian camo shade. While that wash dries, we'll move to the Leviathan. I'm going to use some Corvus Black to start the highlight on his trousers, and I'm going to mix in a small amount of Eshin Grey just to do the highlights. For the white on Jack and the white on the Leviathan, we're going to start with some Grey Sear, and they'll both receive a wash of Basil Canum Grey mixed with some contrast medium. This will have given Bobby's shirt enough time to dry, so we're going to layer in the Ogryn camo again. And then I'll add a little bit of matte white to the mix just to lighten the area for the first highlight. And then I'll add a tiny little bit more matte white to the mix for the second highlight. Then I'll reapply Elysium Green to John, and then I'll add a small bit of Ogryn camo to the Elysium Green for the highlight. Moving back to Jack, we're going to use some Grey Sear to neaten up those areas we just covered with a wash, and we'll do the same with the Leviathan. Then mix in some matte white with the Grey Sear for the first highlight and the bulk of the colour. Do this to the Leviathan as well. And then finally we'll use matte white by itself for the final edge highlight. And again, repeat the process for the Leviathan. It's best to do a couple of coats on the Leviathan as he's got a lot more white on him, and you want the white to look as sharp as possible. Bobby is wearing a shirt underneath his sleeveless jacket, so we're going to paint that with Thunderhawk Blue. And then we'll mix in some Rust Grey for the first highlight. And then mix in a little bit more Rust Grey for the second. Now, Bobby's shirt does have like a crosshatch pattern. You can skip this step if you don't want to, but I've used some Screaming Skull to very, very carefully paint some lines in on the shirt. If you are going to do this step, make sure you take plenty of time and be very careful as well. Next, I'm going to use some Deathworld Forest on Bobby's puffer, and Zandari Dust on Jack's cardigan. Bobby will receive a wash of Athonian camo shade, while Jack gets one of Army Painter's soft tone. While those coats start to dry, I'll use some Doombull Brown to start painting John's jacket. And that will get a wash of Agrac's Earthshade. While that dries, we'll go back to Bobby and relayer his jacket with Deathwald Forest. And then we'll add some Elysium Green to the Deathwald Forest to do the first highlight. And then add a little bit more to do the second. For Jack, we'll relayer his cardigan with Zandri Dust. And then we'll add some Ushabti Bone to the Zandari Dust to do the highlights. Next, we'll use some Dryad Bark to pick out all those buttons. And as you can see on the screen, Jack has a very intricate pattern on the top half of his jacket, so we're going to use some Dryad Bark to try and paint those in. You can completely skip this step if you don't want to. It's best to be very careful and sort of take your time while doing this. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. You can always neaten everything up a little bit later. For John's jacket, we'll go in again with Doombull Brown to start the first highlight. And then we'll mix some Scrag Brown to the Doombull for the second and final highlight. His collar is also a little bit of a darker colour, so I'm going to go and use some Dryad Bark to paint that in. And then I'm going to move to Bobby's backpack, which is going to get a coat of War Flesh, which will be washed with Athonian Camo Shade. While that dries, we're going to paint the Leviathan's tie. It's going to be painted with Evil Sun's Scarlet. And then I'll mix some Wild Rider Red to the Evil Sun's Scarlet for the first highlight. And then it's just Wild Rider Red by itself for the final highlight. For Bobby's bag, I'm going to mix some Warflesh with some Nurgling Green, so it's about 70% Warflesh and 30% Nurgling Green. And then I'll add a little bit more Nurgling Green to the mix, so it's about 50-50 for the second highlight. The straps will be painted with Steel Legion Drab, and that will be given a wash of Army Painter Soft Tone. And while those straps dry, I'm going to use Mournfang Brown to paint in the belts of all the characters that the belts are visible. This will then get a wash of Agrac's Earthshade. I then went back to Steel Legion Drab to add another layer of straps on Bobby's bag. And then I mixed a small bit of Screaming Skull to the Steel Legion Drab just to do the second and final layer. All the belts then got another coat of Mournfang Brown. And then I used Steel Legion Drab to paint in the buckles. And they were given a coat of Nuln Oil. Now the clothes are out of the way, it's time to paint the flesh, so I'm going to use Bugman's Glow on all the exposed areas, followed by a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade. With that wash drying, I'm going to paint everyone's shoes. I'm going to use Dryad Bark on John's, and I'll do the same for the Leviathan. I'll paint Bobby's with Abaddon Black, and I'll use some Abaddon Black to paint in some details on Jack's trainers. All of the shoes will now get a wash with Nuln Oil. With the Reichland Flesh Shade now dry, I'm going to start painting in the eyes, so I'll use a small bit of Abaddon Black, followed by Matte White, and then back to Abaddon Black for the pupils. I'll now continue to paint the rest of the skin. I've done a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Bugman's Glow, then Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself, then a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh. This is for the more sharper details such as the knuckles, the nose and the cheeks. And then finally, the smallest amount of Kislev flesh, just for things like the knuckles, the tips of the nose, and the edges of the ears. The brown shoes will receive another quick coat and highlight of Dryad bark. The black will receive a highlight of Corvus black. And the white areas on Jax will just receive some plain old matte white. I'm now going to move on to the hair, so I'm going to paint Zandri Dust on Jax, Catachan Flesh on Bobby's, and I'll also paint his beard as well. And John and the Leviathan will get a coat of Dryad bark. Everyone's hair will then get a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. While that dries, I'm going to paint the inside of the Leviathan's mouth and his tongue with some Screamer Pink. And then I'll paint his tongue with a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Pink Horror. Followed by Pink Horror by itself, just on the tip and very edges of the tongue. I'll paint his teeth with Zandri Dust. And then I'll use Screaming Skull just to pick out those individual teeth. Bobby's hat will receive a coat of Cantor Blue, but just on the very peak and the first layer, trying to match the card. The first highlight will be a 50-50 mix of Cantor Blue and Calgar Blue, followed by an edge highlight of just Calgar Blue. I'm then going to use Wraithbone to paint the rest of his hat. And then I'll do a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and Matte White for the first highlight. And then Matte White just by itself for the final highlight. All the figures are now done, so I'm going to use Dawnstone to paint the bases. It will take a couple of layers as it is quite a thin colour. And then I'm going to use a very old brush with the tips cut off to stipple some Corvus Black onto the base. I'll then do the same with some Grey Sear. And then using some Corvus Black, I will paint in some cracks. All the rims will then get painted with a Baden Black, which will then get a wash with Agrax Earthshade watered down slightly. Once that dries, that's these guys done. I have to say, once again, Cool Minis or not, knock it out of the park with their miniatures. I absolutely love them. Big fan of Zombicide, and I think their models are always crisp and clean. Absolutely love them. These guys also make for a pretty short project as well, rocking in about 7 hours paint time. If you've made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching. I really hope this helped you out if you're struggling with them, and think about subscribing and sharing this video, and I will see you later. Goodbye for now.